we're talking today with Carly Nichols, who is in 50% in the geography department and 50% in global health studies. And then also with Brandi Janssen, who is in the College of Public Health in occupational and, oh, I just put that down. You've got to be kidding me. I'm sorry. I was trying to expand my screen and instead I squeezed it in. Brandi is in Occupational and Environmental Health, and she is also the director of the Iowa Center for Agricultural Health, Safety and Health. So welcome you both. So we just did a little chatting about what we wanted to cover, and we're going to kind of start broad and then narrow in. So looking first at the conventional food system, specifically in the United States, and what you've both observed since COVID really became a source for concern in the United States. What you've noticed, what maybe surprised you, and what didn't surprise you. Brandi, could you start?
Sure. So, I think what we learned was that the conventional system really doesn't absorb shocks very well, right? With disease, outbreaks in meatpacking plants that had to reduce staff, the ripple effects all the way back the supply chain were pretty significant, which then resulted in a lot of losses for farmers. I think the surprise, and maybe this is true for this whole pandemic, is just the scale of it and the scope of it, and just how quickly it happened, and how it was just not, this system was not able to sort of pivot in any way. If you sold all your onions to Applebee's and Applebee's was shut down for 6 weeks, you had nowhere to sell your onions and they went to waste. So the food waste that happened and the speed with which it happened, I think, was kind of a surprise.
So in that example, like ideally you would be able to like take back your onions from Applebee's and then send them somewhere else. I'm just trying to get a sense of like how it works. It's such a giant system.
Yeah, when you've only got one customer, or you only supply, say, restaurants in general that were then closed, or you only supply to packers who freeze your onions and turn them into blooming onions for whoever sells those, and there's nowhere else to go with them. Even, even if people were cooking more at home, there's only so many onions we're going to manage in our home kitchens, even if we really like them. So there's just kind of nowhere for it to go, and it's perishable. Mm-hmm. And so even if you're, normally process and freeze them, we have limited storage capacity. So it's not like you could store it like you can grains, in the same way. So it either has to be sold or processed, or there's nothing to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that was Americans spend 50% of their food dollars at restaurants and outside of the home. And so to suddenly have all of those outlets shut down, there's a huge infrastructure of producers that grow and simply to meet that demand. And they're all selling industrial size, selling to producers or processors that package in industrial size, not home size. So I know in April and the end of March, there was a lot of observations how it was not so easy to convert these multi-billion-dollar processing operations to make 14-ounce packages instead of 96-ounce packages for institutions. So really what seems like a fairly simple thing to just change the packaging size ended up being this unwieldy exercise, and due to the scale and the size and the investment of the specialized machines that do this, it was just untenable. And so this is why we had farmers in the Southeast plowing cabbages back into their ground en masse, like huge onion graves and potato graves up in Idaho. And I think what Brandi was saying too about the cold chain storage, and just there's no space left. And we saw the same thing with petroleum, where the race for tanker space on the outskirts to hold these commodities just is not there anymore. And I think we've experienced that too with meat and cold chain in the food supply.
And yet you were both commenting on how kind of, well, it strikes me as ironic that some of these farmers are used to dealing with very severe, dramatic events and even pandemics. So if you could give a few examples of those, and then maybe why they're not able to pivot more quickly.
Right. Well, I mean, certainly in Iowa, the highly pathogenic avian influenza outbreak from a few years ago, where we euthanized about half of our inventory of poultry, laying hens primarily, if I'm remembering correctly. So disease outbreaks are not new, and preparedness for disease outbreaks in livestock it's an ongoing conversation. So a year ago, we've now had our national or global pork congress canceled twice in Iowa, which is a big deal in Des Moines. Last year it was because of the African swine flu, as opposed to our current pandemic. So what happens is you have this sort of drop in supply, which changes pricing. And there's not a change, largely because there are lots of federal programs that usually that financially reimburse, right? So there's a built-in sort of insurance and bailout system.
Mm-hmm. And I think that bailout system, a lot of people don't understand exactly how that works. We hear about living in Iowa, you hear about prices going up and down. You also hear about things like, things like dairy being glutted and going into like the school lunch program or something. But if you can give us the 101 version lesson of some of that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I can give a maybe like 99. I don't know if I'd even quite get us to 101 because it is confusing. Most of the farmers I know are also confused by these programs, and every time there's a new one rolled out, there's a lot of discussion about how they work. In this case, farmers who lost 5% of their sales, and then they base this on their data from previous year to demonstrate what that means. Can be reimbursed essentially or supported up to a cap of $250,000 per individual, I think. And so the people could start applying for those by the end of May, and they'll roll out over the course of the summer, I assume. And they're available for crop and livestock and fruit and vegetable, all types of producers. How I know from paying attention a bit to how farmers are responding, they're confused by it. They're not always sure how they apply, how it works. I will say too, I don't know that you're supposed to go into your farm service agency office to apply for them. And I don't know how those offices are operating just in the pandemic situation. I don't know if Carly, if you've talked to people maybe who've had experience with the application process yet. I haven't.
So I have not talked to anyone who's actually undergone it. I guess I talked to one woman who was preparing to undergo it prior to this May 26th sign-up date. But I think that as Brandi's alluding to, there's some complications, and they want to know inventory on January 15th, which is not typically, people typically take inventory at the beginning of the month. And so I know that was causing some problems for folks. I mean, I think the other part of this is just the resources and the operations that are doing everything their own, the real family farm, so to speak, and have to maintain all their own books and learn all of these new procedures on the fly, are certainly going to be disadvantaged than from operations that are more well-financed and have accountants and bookkeepers who can devote all of their time and energy to figuring out the new program and how to get in for it.
Mm-hmm. And you also mentioned some changes that have occurred at the federal level that are also maybe keeping things from being as smooth as they would hopefully be.
Right. Over the course of the past couple years, the USDA has gone through a process of moving a lot of its scientific and professional staff out of DC, where it had been located for ever, and to be sort of closer to the roots of agriculture. They wound up in Kansas City, and in the process of doing so, it happened really quickly. It was sort of, there was an announcement, there was sort of a vetting process for where it was going to be, but it was really a remarkably short time for the staff to make the decision to move by fall of 2019. And I know there have been implications for grant programs, and Iowa State was sort of caught up in some of this and had some challenges getting funding from USDA following the move, just because they lost so much expertise. And so, it's sort of, when you reflect on a lot of federal agencies who've undergone major changes over the last few years, in many cases defunding or losing senior staff, and what that has meant for our response from directly, think about the CDC or pandemic teams. It's true for all sorts of other agencies and entities that are affected by this too. So USDA, I don't know about FDA. We've talked about that, in food safety. I don't know what the situation there is, but it's something to think about, that like a shock in one kind of industry, or we think, well, this is a health issue. Well, but it's going to affect the food system, which means it's all these other entities are also going to be affected.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then if we can transfer just a little, Carly, because you study India, and if you can talk just a little bit about specifically what your research is, and then what you've been seeing occur in India since March.
Yeah, so my research has looked at primarily smallholder farmers in several different states in India, from these more northern sub-Himalayan states like Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh to more eastern central states like down more over by West Bengal. And so in both cases, these are very remote locations that already prior to COVID-19 have issues with reliable transport of food items, and especially with cold storage chain fruits and vegetables. And so because India experienced one of the most aggressive and strict lockdowns in the entire world, which I believe began the end of March to the beginning of April, all of these transport services were further completely cut off. And so there was people that did not have, this is also the summer season in India, so it's about 100 degrees, just no rain, the dry season. It's already the period, sort of the so-called famine period in India, where people are running short on their harvest from the last year's food stocks and waiting for the monsoon to come so they can start foraging and getting more foods from their homestead. So it was already a fairly precarious time for smallholder farmers in India. The sort of sitting and waiting has been interesting in the village, and there's just been a huge upswell of NGOs and other relief organizations that have worked with the government to do mobile kitchens. They've increased food rations. There was extreme concern around hunger and food insecurity in these regions that were completely cut off in the lockdown. And so far, there hasn't been a lot of sort of rigorous understanding or analysis of what exactly the impacts were. But anecdotally, the people that suffered the most were the migrant workers who were caught in the cities when everything shut down and had to walk back to their village settings.
Which is a pretty big number of people.
It was a huge number of people, and so it made the international media for the first several weeks that it was ongoing. I mean, the India lockdown was unprecedented in that the train system shut down, all interstate travel was shut down, there was no bus service, and so it was a really scary scene for the first part of April, with a bunch of migrant laborers who had no place to stay in the city, very precarious workers in the informal economy, rushing bus stands, rushing train stations, everything, nothing moving out of there. and worried about food insecurity, worried about the heat and having how they were going to get back to their villages, which were often hundreds of miles away without any transport services. So I mean, this was ongoing for the end of March, the beginning of April, and as far as I know, and there weren't any reports of large-scale death from this. However, the psychological and trauma toll of being stuck in the city so far from home with nowhere to go is certainly something that should be investigated over the next several years. And I think as sort of we are going to see in the United States, as we're going to go into more of a harvest period over the next couple months, as is India and their monsoons coming, just how this toll of COVID, whether there's an uptick in infections, whether there's further sicknesses that will complicate the way these systems are meant to operate, will have on our food supply. And so I think there's quite a bit of concern and fear still among both people in India and people in the United States around whether the fruits and vegetables that we rely on that come in June, July, August every year are going to be harvested at rates that they've historically been harvested at, or if the labor is just not going to be there.
So let's segue into talking more about local foods.
Yeah.
And, which is where we all started chatting about, because there's been this kind of uptick in it. And I know, Brandi, at some point in your academic career, that was like a particular focus of yours. So I don't know if you want to kind of contextualize some of the work you've done or not. But then you also said that you were wrong in your original call. So maybe share that, and the two of you can discuss what you're seeing now at the local level.
Yes, I always like to explain over and over when I was wrong. No, yeah, so I mean, most of I'm trained as an anthropologist, and my work has largely been looking at local food systems and really thinking, kind of digging into this, farmer-consumer relationship and looking at the other elements of the system that really make it a system. From market management structures and policy and all these other things. And when this all began, I was thinking about, I was feeling more concern about the local food system and the effects on it. Because I was thinking, I was anticipating there would be shocks in the conventional system, but as I said, that is a system that there's a lot of financial support for. And I was worried about a system that was really based on the opposite of social distancing to get to work, right? So what's going to happen if farmers markets are canceled? What's going to happen if, CSAs can't congregate? Or is it about labor too? This is a much more labor intensive system in Iowa than commodity production. And so I was a little surprised to see how easily and mostly without fanfare the local system really pivoted. And in some cases, locally here in Iowa City, again, it was through the work of an outside nonprofit, which is not unusual in Field to Family, sort of organizing an online market system. But even, I know in Western Iowa, there are farmers that are kind of collaborating for alternative market strategies, kind of assembling sort of pop-up type grocery stores and thinking about online deliveries. And they moved really without much of it was just sort of like, okay, well, farmers markets aren't going to work. That's fine, because it's kind of a pain to go sit every Saturday at a market, but I may not sell anything. So let's do something different. And it was, I don't want to suggest that it was easy, because that's not always the case, but it certainly was not, it didn't seem to cause a big disruption in the local food environment. And maybe that in part is because of potential increased demand, as people were worried about the conventional system and looking to the local. That may have helped facilitate it. But that's what I didn't call that accurately.
I also think that, not trying to romanticize anything, but there is more of a culture of cooperation rather than in conventional food systems where it's much more competitive. And so I think, Brandi and me are both interested too in like how that sort of different form of economic organization where people are cooperating and learning from one another rather than competing and trying to outmarket share one another, might have greater resilience for threats, whether future threats from COVID, ongoing threats from COVID, or other things such as climate change. So I think kind of the way that the food system and all of its different various iterations has responded in the last, now I guess it's been like 9 weeks now. I don't know how long it's been, but it's really interesting, and lots of sort of important learnings about resilience of systems and how systems respond to shock and crisis.
Yeah, I mean, it's even been interesting to see how grocery stores have managed at different times. I mean, in all sizes of grocery shopping, so along that food chain.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That kind of gets, Carly, to what I was going to end with was if there is something, I think we're all trying to find silver linings and possible new ways and learning that you see coming out of this for the food system at any level of the food system. What do you hope that might be?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, so I was teaching a class on sustainable development alternatives this past semester. And so it was really great because we were learning about a lot of things about these radical, new, exciting ways where we learn about solidarity and cooperation instead of competition and trying to harness this individualistic profiteering. And then COVID happened, and everybody had the rug pulled out from underneath them, some much more than others, of course. But as a class, we were very excited to see a huge upswell of things such as mutual aid networks, different ways of provisioning and providing food in a lot of major US cities to provide food for the people that were vulnerable to food insecurity due to job loss or due to having to self-isolate because of COVID exposure. And so I think we were excited to see that when there is this sort of like large existential enemy, that we can kind of lose these individualistic tendencies and come and cooperate with one another. I also think that, like Brandi was alluding to, that it's just, we've always had this really strong understanding among sets of the United States public that the industrial food system, the industrial agricultural system is not good for people, that it's producing these inequitable health outcomes of malnutrition, obesity, underweight. It's not good for the environment, it's not good for environmental quality, and it's not good for social equality. And then to have all of that just really splayed out for us in full relief the end of March and April, I think it really hammered home the importance to people of our local communities. And we saw upsurges in interest in home gardening, community gardening, self-provisioning of food, and also on supporting these local people who we know and trust. And so I think that whether or not this interest in kind of like warning niceness of all having to band together on some level, whether that's able to be sustained past the most acute periods of the pandemic is something that we should all be excited about and be interested in. And it's a good thing to find out more information about the local food organizations and our communities and support them.
Yeah, and I think you're right about the sort of ethos of cooperation, particularly through the local and regional food systems. And I guess when I think about like what's the silver lining, one of my questions about local food has always been, I've always sort of pushed back against the there's this kind of local alternative system, and then on the other side of the binary, there's the conventional system. They're totally different. I don't think that's true. I think there's a broad spectrum of different strategies, and people blend them in really interesting ways in Iowa, even on their own farms. And for me, that's been some of the most interesting pieces to research about agriculture. So I think that there is potential, and this is where I'm hopeful, that the systems can learn from each other. And what I've said about local food is that it actually does better when it takes some trappings of the conventional system, when we start thinking a little bit larger about scale, so that we can supply maybe more regional markets. But the conventional system could learn something too, and this might be the opportunity there to think about true diversification and what that would mean for market, being more nimble in markets, different sort of supply chain lengths, if you will, or there are lots of ways that we can, I think about the conventional system and potentially make it more resilient if we choose to learn from those smaller scale systems and apply some of those ideas. So that's what I would, from a more structural standpoint, what I would hope might come out of this. At some point, people are going to get tired, I would think, of bailing out the industrial system. But I've said that for a long time, and so far we have not. So I could be calling that one wrong too, because it seems like we're still bailing them out. But at some point, it might make sense to really think about developing a system that you don't have to bail out all the time.
Definitely.
Yeah. Thank you both. I really appreciate talking with you. And as the granddaughter of an Iowa farmer, I learned a few things. So thank you. Yeah.